My research themes and themes of interest are regional security organizations. If I'm a specialist anyhow, then I'm a specialist on NATO somehow. I'm also covering the European Union as a security organization and increasingly the OSCE. And before I came to Almaty in this position, I haven't done anything about Central Asia as such. So what I'm doing here as a research fellow in Bishkek is also meant to push me a little bit in terms of research towards Central Asia. I had some connections with Central Asia before. I was an OSCE election observer 3 times. But in terms of research, I haven't covered this area before coming to Almaty. So the talk will be structured more or less in 4 parts. And the first part I will briefly talk about the overall context of this theme of regime complexity. In the second part of the talk, I will introduce a little bit the agenda, the research agenda of regime complexity. Will provide you with basic definitions. The third part of my talk will be about my preliminary work about regime complexity in Georgia. So the Southern Caucasus is somehow an area I've been dealing with before, but mainly not as an area studies scholar, but rather I've been dealing with the Southern Caucasus as an object of external interventions, if you want, with the number of security organizations active there, such as NATO, the EU, but also the OSCE. And then in the fourth and last part, I will be talking about regime complexity in Central Asia. And the disclaimer should be probably that I'm really in the preliminary stages about, delving into empirically delving into Central Asia. So much of the fourth part will be questions, hunches, and I think it's a good part to which then a discussion with you could also connect, because some of you, in terms of empirics, might be more knowledgeable about Central Asia than myself. Okay, so let's start with the first part of the presentation. So what is this up to? What do I want to do with this theme of regime complexity? As I said, I dealt with regime complexity in Georgia already, which will be the second part of substance of the second part of the presentation. And the idea is to sort of enlarge the empirics a little bit, to look at other cases concerning regime complexity, and then publish rather conceptual paper about regime complexity with a sort of framework with conceptual theoretical hunches, however, with some empirical substance, of course. And then perhaps at a later stage, publishing an edited volume where I would use this rather conceptual text as an introduction, and then come up with further cases of regime complexity in Eurasian security or something like that. So this is part of a larger would-be endeavor. This is the context of this theme. Concerning the second part, the second part will be about theoretical substance definitions, and the third part, of course, will be about my preliminary work. So concerning the research agenda on regime complexity, one should probably note that there is, in the international relations discipline, a lot of publications, a lot of works out there that somehow deal with I/O interactions, with overlap of international organizations, international security organizations in particular. Authors dealing with these questions are Raphael Biermann, Joachim Kobs, Simon Smith, Carmen Gebhardt, for instance. But they do not explicitly subscribe to a specific literature, to a specific conceptual, theoretical literature. Partially they do. Partially they are dealing with this theme in a rather eclectic fashion, which is not downright wrong. But I'd like to pursue this theme of regime complexity rather in a given kind of literature, more kind of circumscribed literature, and that is exactly the literature about regime complexity that is largely embedded, I would say, in rational institutionalist theory. So many of these authors about regime complexity stem from this kind of stream of thought. And examples include Karen Alter, Sophie Meunier, Daniel Dresner, Robert Cohen, Thomas Gehring, Benjamin Faude, Karl Raustiala, David Victor. So just to name a couple of examples of researchers in this field, regime complexity. And in terms of policy fields, these authors predominantly deal with regulatory politics. Yeah? So they deal with environmental politics, climate change, but also property rights, plant genetic resources, international forestry. So these are examples of rather, regulatory politics. While security in this specific stream of literature is much less covered, with very few exceptions, and one exception is Stephanie Hoffmann, former PhD student of Karen Alter. And my I'm trying to connect myself to this regime complexity literature and kind of enhance it a little bit in the direction of security as a policy field, which concerning many features might be different than simply regulatory politics. And I'm trying to tease that out somehow in this conceptual article I was just talking about. The authors in this stream of literature basically subscribe to the regime definition of Stephen Krasner, more or less, which is widely held, widely cited definition of regime. And he defines regimes as implicit or explicit principles, norms, rules, and decision-making procedures around which actors' expectations converge in a given area of international relations. So regimes as sort of one type of institution. Yeah, there are other types of institutions like international organizations with a secretariat, such as the OSCE, the European Union, NATO, but also other types of institutions like networks, more loose networks like the G7. So regimes are governing, and examples abound, like the climate regime, the human rights regime, just as examples. And concerning the definition of a regime complex, I cite here two. Karl Raustiala and David Victor define a regime complex as an array of partially overlapping and non-hierarchical institutions governing a particular issue area. And Thomas Gehring and Benjamin Faude, in their definition, kind of emphasize the kind of interconnectedness of institutions or elemental regimes, as they call it, in a regime complex. They define regime complexes as systems of functionally overlapping international institutions, elemental regimes that continuously affect each other's operations. Two questions stand out in this literature about regime complexity. Question number one, how do regime complexes arise? So in this case, regime complexes are conceptualized as dependent variables. And the second question is, what implications do regime complexes have for institutional effectiveness? Institutional effectiveness understood as the ability to achieve established objectives. I tend to look more at the second question, regime complexes as independent variables. You know, what consequences does that have, that in certain issue areas there is a large overlap of institutions, although one could plausibly argue probably that answering this second question is not quite possible without trying to answer the first one as well. How do regime complexes arise? And concerning the first question, how do regime complexes arise? The common explanation is an increasing proliferation of international organizations since the end of World War II. Here you can see roughly the rise in numbers of international organizations, starting from roughly 100 in 1945, beyond 300, or roughly 350 in the mid-1980s, and then a relative decline of international organizations. And one explanation of this, an explanation of this rise in international organizations in the first place is there are more problems. There are problems of what Robert Cohen and Joseph Nye would call complex interdependence. Yeah? Problems are more difficult to cope with. And the relative decline in international organizations since the mid-1980s can be partially explained, perhaps, by the end of the Cold War, where international organizations like the Warsaw Pact, the Comecon dissolved. On the other hand, there are new international organizations, the SCO, the CSTO, the OSCE came into being as a full-fledged international organization in 1995. So that probably doesn't fully explain this decline. Some authors argue that parallel to the relative decline in international organizations, there is a rise in in less formal institutions like regimes, and that these are increasingly dealt with to cope with problems instead of more formal international organizations. But there is no definite answer on that. That's part of the discussion. Let's address question number 2. what implications do regime complexes have for institutional effectiveness? And here are two, I would say, schools within the literature of regime complexity, which I simply call the pessimists and the optimists. And the pessimists argue that regime complexity is regularly a source of dysfunction. A state with overlapping memberships may turn to one regime, to one elemental regime that best suits its needs, yeah? Which is being called in the literature like regime shifting or forum shopping. And one such case has been explored by Lawrence Helfer. I think he's a lawyer in the first place, who looked at the TRIPS regime, an intellectual property rights regime, within the context of the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization has been enhanced in the second half of the 1990s with dispute settlement bodies relatively strong. So if member states do not adhere to the stipulations of the WTO and its related implications, then there is a possibility for dispute settlement. And the TRIPS agreement is basically, one could say, a package deal between the industrialized countries and developing countries, where industrialized countries such as the United States, Japan, the EU member states grant developing states greater access to their markets, and on the other hand, they demand adherence to intellectual property rights in the developing countries. And Lawrence Helfer, in his study on that, observes that there is increasing dissatisfaction with this high demands on behalf of the developing states. So they sort of made attempts at inventing other kind of stipulations, other institutions with lower standards, which then results in what he has called like forum shopping, or what can be called also regime shifting, where it's not clear, what is responsible for property rights. There are several stipulations, and altogether this leads to possible challenges of existing principles and norms. And another example, which is more straightforward and related to the OSCE, where a number of member states within regional organizations other than the OSCE have sort of established election monitoring schemes as sort of competition towards OSCE election observation, which is relatively shielded from member state influence. If you think about Oder in Warsaw, they're relatively independent, and often they come up with rather negative assessments of elections. So then within the CIS, within the CSTO, sort of other election observation schemes have been established that sort of present competitive institutional schemes vis-a-vis the OSCE. So these are examples for regime negative impacts or challenges of regime complexity. It's increasingly difficult to decide where authority resides over a given issue. And Daniel Dresner has put that in a nutshell a little bit about the implications, negative implications of regime complexity. I quote, "After a certain point, the proliferation of nested and overlapping regimes, and the legalization of world politics actually abets more realpolitik outcomes. So if it's unclear, what counts, then this might lead to the fact that there is lesser adherence to these rules, and that actually the powerful can do what they want. So what about the optimists? The optimists, examples for optimists, and this is a little bit dichotomic, of course. I mean, there is no, it's my invention, pessimists, optimists. It's a tendency in this literature. And examples are Judith Goldstein, Robert Cohen, Thomas Gehring, Benjamin Faude, David Victor. And they point to the fact, or let's say the international lawyers within this camp of optimists are generally inclined to believe that ever thicker institutions governs the behavior of actors to greater degrees, hence leading to more rule-based outcomes. So that's one kind of belief or argument, if you want. The second argument by scholars like Robert Cohen, David Victor, they argue that the sort of flexibility within regime complexity is actually helpful because regime complexes are more adaptable, more flexible to changing circumstances, particularly in situations of high uncertainty. And one example would be, to stay with this example of property rights or perhaps climate change, if you have developing countries having difficulties for reasons of lack of resources or lack of competences, they might fulfill lower obligations without kind of forcing them, trying to force them to fulfill very high yardsticks, which they wouldn't be able to fulfill in the first place. So Cohen and Victor argue that this is kind of this flexibility that helps achieve certain goals that are better suited compared to non-complex arrangements. The third argument in this camp of optimists is a sort of functionalist argument made particularly by scholars like Thomas Gehring and Benjamin Faude. And they argue in a nutshell that even if there is a regime complex, an array of institutions in a given issue area that is kind of includes functional overlap, non-division of labor, and so forth. They argue that over time, at least, there is a functional pressure towards sort of striking a certain division of labor. And they have looked at the trade regime complex, for instance, where they observe that over time, really there is a certain division of labor, although initially there was a certain overlap. So these are the kind of three key arguments within the camp of optimists in the regime complexity literature. And we now turn to my preliminary work on regime complexity on Georgia. And here I would like to share with you insights, a couple of insights about a crisis and border management. Once again, I try to kind of enlarge this debate beyond regulatory politics, to try to get into the realm of security politics. And here, in crisis and border management and in Georgia, the key argument is that under certain circumstances, at least, regime complexity might be helpful. This is not to say that I would definitely place myself in the camp of optimists. I would definitely say that in certain situations, regime complexity is problematic. Think about a situation in which the three usual Western suspects of regional security organizations, NATO, the EU, and the OSCE, are in principle able to fulfill certain functions. Let's take crisis management or something like that. All of them are able to do that with a certain functional overlap. But in a situation where crisis management is needed, it is unclear which of these organizations should be doing the job. Yeah? So regime complexity can definitely be having its negative aspects, but I'm trying to mention a couple of examples where regime complexity has certain advantages. And the first example, well, probably that's too small, I'm sorry about that. The first example is crisis management in Georgia, where you can generally say that both NATO and the EU have at a certain point, let's say by the mid-2000s, have been able to do crisis management. The European Union has developed specific resources since the end of the 1990s. So both had basically toolboxes for doing crisis management. And then at the end of the 2000s, we experienced the Georgia-Russia war, where then the question was who steps in, which security organization. And we can witness that it was the European Union. There has been an institutional choice. The European Union did the job of crisis management. Later, election, large-scale border monitoring. And the question is, why not NATO? And the answer is, it's a question of institutional choice. And the answer is largely about reputation. I mean, the European Union as a crisis management actor enjoys greater reputation, particularly vis-à-vis Russia. So NATO wouldn't have been acceptable for Russia in the first place. So the key argument then is that despite different toolboxes in the area of crisis management regarding two regional security organizations covering partially the same space, there was the possibility of institutional choice, and the European Union did the job. The second example is border management in Georgia. And that's about the OSCE and the European Union. And here one could say that the CSCE, OSCE did develop expertise in border management, which in Georgia developed out of its mission, particularly in the 1990s. And this led to the situation where the OSCE was engaged in border management, border monitoring since December 1999 against the backdrop of civil war in Chechnya. But then, due to the requirement for unanimity in the Permanent Council of the OSCE, Russia didn't want to see this border monitoring activity of the OSCE continued. So it sort of vetoed the continuation of this border monitoring, border management, so that beyond 2004, it was not foreseeable that border management, border monitoring could be done. But due to the fact that the European Union did develop expertise in border monitoring, border management as well, the EU sort of stepped in. Yeah? Russia was unable, of course, to veto operations in the decision-making framework of the EU. So the EU, based on its expertise, its functional overlap concerning border management, border monitoring, it could step in and developed an integrated border monitoring operation from September 2005 onwards. So here one could say in the first case it's a sort of reputational advantage of overlap. In the second case one could talk about a practical advantage of overlap, yeah? Functional overlap, the possibility that one of these two security organizations could substitute what the other had been doing and which it was unable to be doing beyond 2004. Okay, let's turn to regime complexity in Central Asia. And I alerted you already that my empirical the empirical substance of this part is rather preliminary, tentative. I tend to ask questions rather than coming up with systematic findings already. Generally, one could say that there is regime complexity in Central Asia as well. There are a number of transboundary problems with the security relevance, terrorism, religious extremism, water, and so forth. And against that backdrop, cooperation in the realm of security does make sense. So there are cooperative gains. Gains from cooperation can be certainly expected. There is a great number of regional organizations involved in problem solving in the security realm in Central Asia, although to different degrees. If you take NATO's PFP, Turkmenistan, although literally it participates in the Partnership for Peace of NATO, it has confined its participation to strictly civilian measures, non-military measures within the PFP, which includes like security sector reform and so forth. It rules this out. But the 5 Central Asian states are involved in these regional organizations, partially members themselves, partially not. And at the same time, this is somewhat of an excursus, but still important, I think. There is always the question, why no regional security organization in Central Asia, in which all 5 Central Asian states are members, but which does not go beyond the region, epitomizing sort of very specific regional problem solving. There is a lot of regionalist rhetoric. If we think about the last Central Asia Summit 2018 in Astana, where there was a lot of integration rhetoric once again. And a partial answer to this question might simply be, and here I'm unveiling myself as a rational institutionalist again. I mean, what is the point for the 5 Central Asian states in creating their own security organization if there are so many donors already around, which might be simply cheaper than creating an own regional security organization? That might be a partial answer. Another part of the answer is probably sovereignty sensitivity in the process of nation building. The 5 Central Asian states shy away from giving too much authority to a regional organization. So, okay, but that's somewhat of an excursus. Important to note is also that the 5 Central Asian states have conflicting preferences, which is embodied partially in their partially varying memberships of in international organizations. So I quoted as a source Anna Gusarova partially for shifting the blame on her for including Tajikistan in the EAEU, which I think is not yet the case. But I think this kind of neatly gives an overview of the variance of Central Asian member states in a diversity of international organizations, security organizations. Let's turn to regime complexity in Central Asia more specifically. And here, one case is certainly border management. Border management represents one such regime complex. Several IOs are involved in this issue area, including the UN, with a number of sub-organizations, agencies from the UN system, such as UNHCR, the OSCE, the EU. So altogether, there are about 30 beneficiary institutions involved, although some of them have merely implementing functions, such as the Deutsche Gesellschaft für Zusammenarbeit. But there is a plethora, really, of institutions involved in border management in Central Asia. So coming to the point of where I pose questions rather than giving answers is to emphasize that border management in Central Asia is a potentially interesting case. Although I'm not yet sure whether a specific trajectory, institutional trajectory might be at play here, or a combination of several trajectories. Like in the case of Georgia, where you could talk about reputational advantages, practical advantages. Possible trajectories might be institutional competition. Is there an inherent tendency of IOs to expand their functional spectrum? Perhaps also competition over different pathways to border management. And frankly speaking, I didn't delve into this empirically well enough, but the EU with its POMCAR program also always keeps emphasizing integrated border management, which might be sort of a specific approach, a specific philosophy over others, more militarized approaches. There might be a functionalist logic at play, leading to a division of labor, as evidenced by Gehring and Faude. So despite a huge array of institutions involved in border management, over time, some institutions may have stepped out because perhaps there was another institution with a greater comparative advantage. Is there a certain, perhaps geographic division of labor? Are there any reputational or practical advantages? Some of these institutions might enjoy over others. And with the last slide, kind of further, going further with posing questions instead of giving definite answers, I like to focus on POMCAR, the EU program, which most of you should be aware. And I think one question one could pose is sort of framing this as a puzzle. Why does the EU, with its POMCAR program, enjoy such a prominent role in this regime complex? Although, A, the European Union is far away from the region. The EU started its program in 2003, when the EU started its neighborhood policy. Yeah? So why spending so much resources for border management in a faraway region, Central Asia? B, although, why does the EU deploy POMCAR? Although it's the only IO in the regime complex in which all of the 5 Central Asian states are not members. Yeah? B, and C, although the CSCE, the OSCE, had developed already a widespread expertise in border management during the 1990s already. And here I come with possible answers. I should rather frame it perhaps as hunches. And the first hunch is the institutional design, choosing the European Union, POMCAR, as a center, a lead center of this regime complex, allows to leave out the 5 states as potential veto players. Yeah. The second hunch is offering POMCAR for Central Asia was a deliberate move of EU members in order to implement a specific border management philosophy, IBM, as I told, that would have been unattainable in other institutional settings, given different memberships as a whole unfavorable to such a concept, such as in the SCO, the CSTO, or the OSCE. The third hunch is relatively straightforward. Simply POMCAR, with its ability to draw on huge EU and EC funds, is simply able to muster sufficient financial resources that the OSCE, the SCO, and the CSTO would be unable to provide. And a fourth potential answer hunch is that POMCAR was perhaps a deal primarily within the West, according to which the EU makes a contribution to dealing with the Afghanistan threat and the Afghanistan-Central Asia nexus, given the commencing NATO ISAF operation in 2003. So these are potential answers to this question, and I might be wrong in posing this question in the first place. It might be that it's not the case in the first place, that POMCAR could be considered the or one center of this border management regime complex in Central Asia. But if it's the case, and if it's convincing that this is a puzzling question, then it's worth kind of trying to answer it. And as I said, this is rather tentative. These are rather hunches than empirically rich answers to questions. And I'll leave it here, and I'm curious to your questions and comments.